Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. We just came off of our special edition we did about 9/11 in the post 9/11 world, and you guys seem to really enjoy that. So I'm glad that panned out. But we're going to cover the regular news that we missed last week and over the past few weeks actually. Just sort of wrap up some stories and give more details about other stories that were developing. As we said, I think it was the last main episode, but what we have right now is Belarus, and there's been a lot of interesting developments in Belarus. I know you've been paying attention to this way more intently than I have, so without further ado, GSP.
Yeah. Now there's been several developments. Of course, we know that Putin and Lukashenko have went to Sochi, and there's several things that have come out of it. Now, there was no press briefing whatsoever after this meeting, but a $1.5 billion loan was granted to Lukashenko. Russian forces that were there for policing purposes on the border with Belarus have been removed. So, what this seems to say to me is that um, there's a closer partnership here, and I mean, at the end of the day, uh, Belarus has to appear as a fully independent nation. And, on some level, we know this is not. On the one hand, we know it's part of the union state with Russia. Belarusians can go anywhere in Russia. They have basically the same rights, medical treatment should they need it, and so on. Right. So it's kind of already semi-integrated. Um, but there's a geopolitical theory that it has to look like it's fully autonomous, right? Like, and then the way that the Minsk agreement, as if like Belarus was this neutral country where you could have these meetings chaired, and it would be impartial. And so now, yeah, nobody, who's following the Minsk agreements for the last 6 years? Nobody. But all to say, it adds a kind of legitimacy, right? So that's the way I would view Belarus. And this might also indicate that despite the size of these protests, the strategies are going to have to change. The protest this weekend was fractionally smaller, from the sources I read, than the previous weekend. However, they were large. They were quite large. But there were more arrests. And now a kind of feature has settled in with these protests, that they're almost entirely made up of women. Like, I don't know what that is. I don't know whether they feel that that's going to gain more sympathy from the outside world looking in. I don't. It would seem so, or I don't know if they're men. A lot of them were arrested if they've been like really intimidated and they won't do it.
I'm just
But
wondering if
ultimately,
it's just some cat lady at the State Department saying, "Oh, it's women are the future. The future is female," and giving all the money to like these feminist groups, whatever. I mean, to the extent that the State Department is involved, which I would say it is undetermined yet. But that's what I see happening whenever I see these all women protests talking about, "Oh, you're just mad because nobody is sleep with you," like them yelling at the Belarusian police before they crack their skulls open. But I digress.
guys, I have something even more effective than Pussy Riot. Okay, hear me out.
Speaking of which, they've been trying to rehabilitate them. That I do want to cover that as a little aside as part of this after this, but continue.
Yeah, so that's a good point you raised, that this could be basically some kind of news. I mean, obviously it's a new strategy. Obviously it's a new strategy. Um, they're going to try to see if there's going to be moral outrage around the world, but I don't, the media is still holding on to it. You're going to see clips after every weekend, but protests that are only protests that are only on every weekend don't always have such a long lifespan. I mean, you could argue the Yellow Vests contradict that, and that would be true. But the Yellow Vests have been incredibly unsuccessful. So I would say that I expect things to begin calming down also with the colder weather coming. I don't think they feel it's, I don't think, basically the two main developments from the Sochi meeting are Russia's going to give them a big, an important deal, an important loan, sorry, and Russia doesn't feel the necessity to have to go in. That to me says that they've got this basically under control for the moment. For the moment. And yeah, so we'll have to see if the strategy begins to change. I think the strategy is dead. It's over. So we might see a very different strategy next weekend. They will have to move to daily protests. Like they can't just be on Saturday and Sunday. And I understand that there's protests throughout the day. I get that, but they're far far smaller. And it's almost like everybody in Belarus on the weekend wants to go to Minsk and be part of this protest, this relatively peaceful protest, and then they go home.
Do you think there's any
That's
like
not going to.
busing activity, for example, like we see with Antifa here in the states and everything? I wouldn't be surprised, but I haven't seen anything that either would prove or disproves that.
I don't think there's enough indignation or even enough economic problems in order to persuade the people to become more violent. Not at the moment. We're not seeing it. They've been going on for 2 months, and so far it's not. I mean, well, not 2 months, but let's say 5 6 weeks, and so far it does not look convincing. Most of the violence, I mean, yes, I know people are being arrested and they're being beaten with batons, but if you look carefully and if you go to various news sources, you're going to see people trying to beat up cops as well. But it's nothing like the first 2 nights after the election. I felt like the protests then had much more bite, much more potential, and I don't see it now. They after like I think it only took about a week for them to try the female approach, where these huge mass of women would protest. Well, I mean, they can all try to leave, like they can all like move somewhere else. I don't know what to say. Um, but so far, it's not really winning people over. I don't think Lukashenko feels particularly threatened right now. And yes, NGOs were allowed into the country. That was a big mistake. Yeah, and of course you have to think like, so what's the long range plan, right? Like, if Belarus is basically a hologram of an independent state next to Russia, then what's the point of the NGOs? So maybe that in and of itself is like, maybe this is like a cathartic moment in order to like release the potential of a rebellion in order to um, thwart thwart it later on. I don't, you know what I mean? I don't know. I don't know if this is just a valve release or not, but it is something to think about. It is something to consider. Um, I'm not suggesting that Russia has 100% control over Belarus. It can't afford to, because if it did, then the hologram would be more obvious. So at the moment, Belarus is just kind of going on in a kind of a frozen conflict. There's nothing decisive happening, and yeah, this Russia is going to sort of pull back a little bit.
And let me just say, what a stark contrast from the Maidan from Ukraine. At this point, with the way the protests were going in the first few weeks, I was expecting unidentified snipers in Minsk just gunning people down at this
Yeah,
point, and
yeah.
we're not at that
They
point.
may they may get that desperate. It may come down to that.
But
It
it's
may come down. I mean, never say never.
I'm not ruling it out. But at least at this point, I would. I'm just saying I would have expected them much earlier. That I would have expected them
Yeah,
several weeks ago, like back in August, even arguably, I don't know, back
yeah,
in July, when the
yeah.
with those first bubbling under the surface. But this seems to have been a tougher nut to crack for whoever's behind this. And I'm starting to
Hmm.
think that, is it a lack of resources? That are they willing to put less into it, or are they willing to put less into it because they see it as less successful, or uh, less important? But
Yeah.
I have to say, this year has been a year full of surprises, and Belarus doesn't get excluded from that. They are not an exception to that rule. And you're gonna have to help me out with the pronunciation. The self-proclaimed president was recognized by the Lithuanian government, wasn't she?
Right. What was it? What is it? Tikhonovskaya?
Yeah,
But
something like that.
yeah, 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 they're going to make all those claims. Of course, Lithuania has probably been. I mean, Lithuania is also like Belarus, but for America, right? It's kind of like a hologram of an independent nation, right? So it's going to do those kind of things, and that adds a certain amount of credibility, right? Um, but I would say that this is less of a concern for Russians. So this is okay. Let me put it to you this way: this is not an easy thing to manage because in Belarus, right, the pay, like there's still a majority that would like an integration with Russia. Most of them. So the largest number of the demographic are people 62 and older, right? Well over 65% would like integration with Russia. When you get down to like 35, 40, 50 years of age, it's like 50 or less. And then with the youth, it's more like, no, the youth, like 18 and above, is like 50% for it,
Yeah, it's
right?
it's it's surprisingly high numbers. The fact that half of the youth still
Yeah.
view integration with Russia as preferable to integration with the West.
Right, right. Okay, so um, I will get to my point, but I think what I'm going to say now will illustrate.
Um, Only about 17% of Russians actually want Belarus to integrate with Russia. But a larger proportion of, obviously, a larger proportion of Belarusians would like to be integrated with Russia. Now you have kind of like another problem, right? Like the nationalists and in Belarus seem to gravitate towards. If you exclude the ones that don't want to be part of Russia, that's the demographic I'm talking about. So they have a lot of Eurocentric uh, ideologies, right? They can be anywhere from like EU with LGBTQ rights, and they can go to the other end of the spectrum, which is like right wing, Nazi fanboys, people who thought like if if the Germans had won World War II, we would be free, that kind of thing, right? So those are the extremes of the spectrum, and um, but they're still small in number. And my guess is like Russia wants to find a way to like balance this scenario out because it has to deal with this number, small as it is. It's able to be commanded by Western powers in order to like destabilize Russia. So in a way, not integrating with them gives them a buffer. You see what I mean? Also, like most of their public isn't invested in it. They don't care or they don't want it, right? So that's the predicament that Russia is in with respect to Belarus. And Belarus with its own like ideologies that it has to juggle with. So that's what I sort of have to say about Belarus at the moment.
Yeah, it seems to be a general weathering of the storm at this point for Russia, for Lukashenko, to the point where it's not a good situation for them right now. They're not that there's a lot better places they could be, but in general, it also could be a lot worse. Lukashenko could be the next Yanukovych. He could have invited in the Western NGOs and then fled to Russia. Russia could be dealing with another Ukraine on its doorstep, but it's not. So, will it get to that point?
Yeah.
I have absolutely no idea. Time will tell. I would have expected a lot worse by now, as I was saying earlier. I was expecting these snipers and unidentified buildings and unidentified allegiances at this point. But so far, it seems like cat ladies are the strategy, and who knows how long that will last. Maybe that will be their death knell. Maybe they will just get the insufferable women to drive the protests on the ground. Maybe this was the fatal flaw. Who knows?
Right. And the lady protests are just feelers. They're just feelers to see kind of how invested other protesters are in all of this, to see if like the women can be worn down, or whether the violence that will be visited upon the women, whether that will irk Belarusian men to come out in support. So I think it's not just for Western eyes, for Lukashenko to fall into the quote unquote dictator trap, in terms of how he's perceived worldwide through Western media, but also to see what are Belarusian men going to do. So far, I don't see them doing very much. So that may change.
Yeah, and I wonder, like,
there isn't enough Belarusian hostility towards Russia, like there is in Ukraine.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing. Ukraine has the very strong ethnic identity in central Ukraine and western Ukraine that they can play on, where these are the ones who sided with the Germans in both world wars, and the ones who were part of the Austrian Empire up until, of course, the 1900s, the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there's definitely that stark divide there. Belarus, much less so. Even the ones who consider themselves ethnic Belarusians consider themselves much closer to Russians than they do to Ukrainians or Poles, etc. Now, there's exceptions to all of those, but mostly they are either neutral towards Russia or have positive feelings towards Russia. So there's not that same sentiment they can play on. So, of course, they're going with this sort of more liberal angle. Now, of course, you'll get this few Stahlhelm wearers, etc. Those types you always see. But you also have the question, because the media is very good at these sort of things. And by the media, I mean pretty much every media, whether that be American state media, Russian state media, etc. How big are these strong, empowered women protests? Like, how many women do you think are actually participating in these versus what the camera angles show, what the media shows, versus reality?
I've seen shot what appears to be at least 20, 30 stories high in the air. And, I would not hesitate to say that some of these protests are well in excess of 50,000 people. Like, there's a lot of people. And boy, do they have a lot of flags. I mean, almost everybody has a flag. And but I'm not sure what's going on. Like I say, I think basically this is a test bed, and I think it'll be a test bed for Russia proper, to deal with like the possibility of a liberal revolution in Russia should it come. Like how, there's lessons to be drawn. I'm not suggesting like Russia's pulling all the strings here. Of course not. But yeah, the numbers are not small. They're not insignificant. But it remains to be seen. It hasn't been effective, no matter how large they are. And quite honestly, like, it's kind of low energy. Like
Oh yeah.
the amount of women doing this, like how many women want to actually be on the front lines? Like, like I saw one poster that was made with a woman who's naked and she's lying on the floor of a on top of a Belarusian flag, the old red and white, and she's been beaten. This is what Lukashenko did to me. So they're going with that kind of imagery. But yeah. So I mean, the truth is, it's hard to spin it because they're not oppressed. Um, their lives are better than many other Eastern European countries, and you know, just don't go to the protests.
Simple as. Simple as.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to apologize before we go any further because I've noticed this just listening to myself. A little bit of allergy problems today, so I'll try to keep the coughing and sneezing to a minimum. I've been trying to mute the mic when I can, but I know I probably sound very stuffed up right now, but I'm just going to try to power through this because this is a very big episode, and I want to do this, and it's probably the only opportunity this week I have to do it. So, if
Mhm.
that's if I don't worry, I'm not as sick as I probably sound. I'm not actually not sick at all. This is completely allergies. But just to continue on what you were saying, it almost is like a petri dish for Russia. They can sit back, they can observe the situation. Will it get better? Will it get worse? And they can draw up their own strategy. They can, because I would say, especially compared to Ukraine, this is a much more comparable situation for Russia. This is like on a very like small scale, but would play out the same just on a larger scale in Russia. So there's definitely that, and it's also giving Russia the opportunity to make some preliminary moves in terms of how they're going to deal with the situation in Eastern Europe in general, in the former Soviet Union in general. And it looks like the response has been measured, but I would say pro government more so than pro Lukashenko. And like I said, just to reiterate, I think they've weathered this storm for the time being.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree wholeheartedly. There's some people who feel like, and I kind of felt it too. 2014, 2015 was the last great push by, I would say, the Western neoliberal order, and the battle was fought in Eastern Ukraine, and basically the Russian side won. Basically, that's what happened. Um, you know, neoliberal order still expands, but it also becomes more fragile. And once we get into Kosovo, I think we'll see how.
And I'm not. I'm just continuing what you said. I'm not gonna say Russia botched the situation in Ukraine, but they won despite their actions because I would say it was more of the West's failure than Russia's victory in that case.
I honestly, yeah, I agree, and I understand that perception when we look back at Ukraine. But my own feeling is that Russia intentionally looked and acted the part of this blundering nation that allowed these things to happen. I think I think they played dumb, and I think it worked out for them. I really, really do. When I look back, um, I can't imagine that Russia was that much more naive 6 years ago than it was in 2008 with the Orange Revolution. Right? Only only 6 years separated those two periods, and Russia was much more unprepared in 2008 than it was in 2014. And I have to think that basically everything that Yanukovych did, that this might have been intentional. I'm going to go with that hot take. But I totally understand that Russia. The other option is that Russia acted very quickly and always made the right move.
I would say by virtue of Crimea alone, they made the right move, and I do sympathize. I somewhat understand your idea of a queen sacrificing Ukraine, willing to sacrifice again what was like good for them, but was willing in order to keep what was necessary for them, as I put it a few shows ago.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah. I thought that was well put.
just to wrap this topic up, to just keep all the regions together before moving on to the Balkans, it looks like what is it? I think the State Department is really trying to like revamp Pussy Riot and trying to make them into a significant force in Russia again after they've been even shunned by the Russian public. And I can't remember the exact story for the life of me, because the most recent story before this was one of them allegedly committed suicide, which wasn't a surprise given the kind of
Yeah.
lifestyle she led. 32-year-old unmarried childless woman who spent her life as a professional activist for Western liberals. And of course, that was blamed on Putin. He definitely was behind that. So, but
Yeah.
I can't remember the most recent news for the life of me. I think actually Russia did
Well,
took
one of
some
them I
legal.
think returned. One of them I think returned or remained and is, fighting on with her activism.
Yes, that was
There's
it.
two
That was
other
it.
ones that are living in the U.S. I think.
Yeah. I remember they protested something in Alabama like a year and a half ago. So that's what it was, and really trying to like rally the movement in exile. It was very I don't even know the word for it. Typical, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we're gonna look back at Pussy Riot and just think like, how cringe was this? The bright colors, the ski masks, like it was just so cringe.
Yeah, let's take our shirts off. Whoa.
Right, and then there was that, like, they had sex in the Hermitage, right? Like
Yeah.
that did not warm people's hearts to them. Another one was there was another video of a woman who, I believe it was a small chicken or a quail, frozen. I won't tell you where she put it. That she took out of a supermarket. Like that kind of stuff just grossed people out.
Yeah. I mean,
Like it
that
wasn't
would that would
rad, man.
that would
Like,
gro-
oh, Putin is gonna really hate this.
that would gross
He's
out
gonna get so mad.
that would gross out most Westerners with as desensitized we are today, and now apply that to Russians. Imagine how much
Yeah,
how
and
much
this would
lower
have
their
been like
tolerance
6,
for
7
this
years
is.
ago.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, they just nobody even cares about them. And in fact, people don't even care about Navalny anymore.
Yeah, because he survived. I saw the picture of him in Germany with all his the medical team that took care of him, and yeah, he looked like completely normal, completely healthy as somebody like him can look. But I suppose with that, we'll move on to the Balkans, to Serbia, to the deal that was made, and it turns out
Yeah.
I would say we both, especially me, had a negative outlook on it, but it looks like the devil is in the details, at least for the U.S., because Serbia scored quite a few victories with that, including open trade with Kosovo, which will actually increase that. You went into some of the demographic information off air with terms of more Albanians are leaving Kosovo than Serbs are leaving Kosovo, and just the immigration rate of Albania proper and Serbia proper. And you also went into some of the stuff about Russia having like a foot in the door, a small base in Serbia in terms of
Indeed.
rapid deployment.
Yeah.
So again, I'll let you take the reins on this one again.
Yeah, so you know what? This is a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, it's understandable why it would piss off the dissident right, especially in the West, for Serbia being forced into denouncing Hezbollah, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, and all of this stuff. Like, Trump sidelining this whole thing, in a way has thrown the spotlight off of some of the other aspects of this deal that, like, people should actually pay attention to. And it's not all bad, right? Like, and it would be great if, like, Vucic says "F you, America," Putin, my friend, right? That would have been awesome. Of course, everybody wants that, but let's step back a little bit, right? So what this deal does is it offers Serbians a right of return. They can. It's not even just a right of return. Any Serbian, whether they were living in Kosovo or not, can now move to Kosovo. Number two, it gives protection of their churches and historic sites. Number three, the government is obligated now to work to find Serbs that were murdered during the wars in the 90s in the Kosovo region. And this is ostensibly not an agreement between Kosovo and Serbia. This is an agreement between Serbia and America. Serbia does not recognize Kosovo as a state. Okay. The other thing that it does is, unlike like in Yugoslavia, Kosovo was an autonomous region. Okay. And, the Serbs were depopulated from that area, and it was an ongoing process, at least a century old. Without getting into that, basically, it was a it always needed substance. It always needed basically Belgrade to bail it out. Okay. Now, in this deal,
which is a common thing
America
you
is
find
going
in
to
pretty much every federal system. There's always the givers and always the takers, even in the U.S.
right. So now, basically, what America has agreed to is they're going to step back and they're going to finally allow Serbian products to enter Kosovo in order to sell them. This is a free trade deal. It's a mini Schengen in the Southern Balkans. And Serbia is going to, economically, Serbia is going to win this. And demographically, if the people really, really want to invest, and maybe when things economically pick up, they will be able to invest by moving down there, right? The opportunity is there. It is open now, right? And they're going to also gain tax revenue from products coming into Serbia, right? So there's a lot of bonuses here, right? Now, nobody likes the whole, you have to also be on board with like LGBTQ rights. But one could argue that the EU has never looked weaker trying to enforce LGBTQ rights. All you have to do is look at the daily news coming out of Poland and secondarily the news coming out of Hungary. They're not taking it seriously. And Serbia is not even in the EU, right? And it's going to be America's decision to decide whether it wants to let's say whether it wants to cut off this whole deal over LGBTQ rights in a very sort of small and remote geography with respect to the rest of Europe. Okay, so I think that there's more good than bad in this, and that's the way it should be looked at. Now, there should still be like big-hearted patriots, Serbian patriots, who are weary. That's important, right? Because all the players know that the Serbs are going to be upset by this, right? But it's important not to get too black-pilled. At the same time, that creates a kind of a pastiche that actually helps to cover up some of the good things that are going to happen for Serbia, right? And appear like it's a Western victory. It's not really that much of a Western victory at all. Like, if Serbia plays this right, in the next 10 years, they're going to be unequivocally the winners out of this deal.
Yeah,
you can take
a lot of concessions were made, and who the winner is, like you said, is yet to be determined. Now, the West could outmaneuver Serbia, and we could get a Serbia under the control of a certain big global homogenization, just to put it in YouTube-friendly terms. Or, like you said, it could be them reasserting themselves, I would say, since the first time since the fall of Yugoslavia, to the point where Serbia, I wouldn't say is necessarily relevant on the world stage, but can at least enforce its will to a limited degree, more than I would say a lot of other countries can. And also in terms of making the EU Go on.
Well, without firing a shot, basically, what they're getting is revenue and land. Like that, ultimately, that's a good thing, right? Because the Albanians are not invested in it. The Albanians in Kosovo are not really invested in it.
Oh, of course not.
They right, they're leaving for greener pastures elsewhere in the EU, and this ultimately, this land means more to the Serbians than it does to the Albanians.
Yes. And also in terms of the EU looking weaker, you made that point with the enforcement of LGBTQIA rights in Hungary and Poland, how those have constantly been stifled. Also, keep in mind, the European Union was completely opposed to a deal between Serbia and Kosovo in the first place, and as you said, it was a deal between the US and Serbia, but point being is, Trump sidestepped Europe when it came to making a deal because he tried to redraw the borders. He had that negotiations with the ethnic redrawings, and it culminated in this, but still, it also is just another schism in the West.
Yes, yeah, and it's what I was saying in very early August, late July, that America is going to start making a kind of unilateral deals outside of the complete framework of NATO, and even with its like close relationship with the EU. Right? It's going to do this because you can see there's a kind of restructuring. I mean, for heaven's sakes, like there's a quasi coup happening in the U.S. at this moment, right?
Hey, you know who else
So
is making independent deals from the West? Another Western leader?
Macron,
Yep.
yeah, because I know Greece is buying the what is it, the Rafael aircraft? It's a really nice aircraft based on the Euro, but slightly different.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think the funniest thing out of all of this with Trump acting, I would say, like a semi-rogue, same with Macron, is watching Germany and the UK, who like to play by the rules, get left in the dust. I'm just a side note. I find that
Yeah,
amusing.
it's a good point.
But
Yeah, so
yeah,
overall, this is not a bad deal. Serbia can really capitalize on this. So the deal basically is a Schengen with Kosovo, Serbia, and North Macedonia. I'm not certain about Montenegro, and actually, that's another important victory for Serbia. Is the latest election results coming out of Montenegro? Like it's just not not rumors. Rumors would be the wrong word, but there's already like talk about maybe Montenegro reintegrating itself into Serbia. All I'm saying is um, this is a way for Serbia to gain economic strength. It's still it still has more tanks than anybody in southeastern Europe, uh, and that's much to the chagrin of the EU. Uh, so they're playing it carefully, and again I stress, like, notice that the deal was made at the point where the EU has been the weakest it's been in decades.
oh, absolutely. Like I said, actually, this comes on the heels of Europe opposing any sort of deal, which again, as I said, the original deal had to do with the redrawing of borders, and it was in 2019 when Macron used France's veto power to reject a lot of applications for the European Union in the Balkans, such as Albania,
Yep.
such as North Macedonia, such as Serbia. Uh, there wasn't Bosnia also in there too, I think.
I'm not sure.
But point being,
Um,
those are the big three ones, especially Albania and Serbia.
yeah.
So as the European Union becomes less relevant, and as the United States has a restructuring, I would say, of its empire, whether it's voluntary or not, we still have this as the result.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, not all bad news.
So speaking of bad news or convoluted deals, I suppose we should move on to the other big story for today.
Hmm.
So after the United Emirates, after Bahrain, Saudi Arabia joins in on normalizing relations with Israel. Now, we all saw this coming. This
Yeah,
has been something brewing under the surface for such a long time at this point. There's always been a
for
lot of
decades.
backdoor deals, always been a lot of secret relations, but lo and behold, they are officiating it. And there's rumors 7, 8, or 9 other Arab countries may be joining in. Now, this has been Trump's big diplomatic, I would say, his big diplomatic move into the lead up to the election campaign. On look at how much of a peacemaker I am. I deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. Blah 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 blah. We've heard all this stuff before with other semi-successful deals. At least early on, the Korea situation looked promising, but that has dissipated. So, what other way to do it than to please the state of Israel? And it looks
Yeah.
like it's going that way. But a part of me says this is also a move of desperation on the part of Israel and the Arab states, because why else would they need to show their solidarity and unity other than that they feel threatened?
Right. I don't. I don't think that the average Bahrainian or Saudi Arabian or Emiratian, are necessarily in favor of this deal. Not that they could really voice that effectively. Um, However, it should be kept in mind that I think the Middle East is even more volatile than the Balkans, and a lot of these deals are kind of like truces. They're kind of like a peace treaty, and peace treaties don't last forever. They don't. Some of them don't even last very long. So yeah, they're recognizing them, but everyone, virtually everyone who listens to our show, you and I have known that these countries were working with for Israel for quite a long time, and Syria has been pivotal in being able to disclose that, because they all have you know kind of the same concerns about that region and where it's going with respect to Syria and with respect to Yemen. So it's not a surprise. It's just a formal recognition. But the cooperation has been going on for a very long time. Well, I mean, relatively very long time. We're not talking centuries, but
Yeah, since the Cold War, that is. And correction, since the I would say since the Cold War, but especially since the Iranian Revolution, they saw a common foe in that. Despite fun fact, Israel provided weapons to Iran to fight Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. So a lot of people don't know that, because Soviet Union supported
yes,
Iraq, U.S. supported Iraq, most European countries supported Iraq. I think even China supported Iraq, and Israel supported Iran. That's I find that funny.
it boggles my mind.
It's it's an insane world we live in when that is the situation. But this harkens back to
I mean, a lot of it too was basically to prolong the war and to create a situation of mutual destruction. That may factor into it, but
yeah, fair enough.
yeah, you could argue also. But you could also argue that Israel was afraid of Saddam's reach with Scud missiles. They're not terribly effective, but I think Israel was looking maybe 10, 15 years down the road, they would be effective.
And despite that, they're even just a good terror weapon to rain on a country if you want to scare them into submission to your demands at the time. But the other point I wanted to make about this was this harkens back to Mike Pence's 2018 APEC speech. And in that speech, he said, now some people say it was a slip, some people say he shouldn't have said it, some people said it was intentional that he said it. The winds are changing. Old enemies are becoming allies, referring to Israel and a lot of the Arab Gulf states, against a new common foe, and just going on this very emboldened speech like that, talking about how the Arab countries are now more willing to cooperate with Israel, and then all of a sudden before the election we have these, I would say, as you would call them, peace treaties or truces being made, where it probably won't hold up forever. And a point I used to make early on in the show when war with Iran seemed much more likely is that if there actually was some sort of war or regime change in Iran, watching the Gulf states and Israel turn on each other would be a very entertaining new development. Because after Iran collapses, there's really no reason for Saudi Arabia and Israel to be all buddy-buddy, and it's just the growing fear of Iran, which Trump was drumming up earlier this week, talking about Iran is planning a retaliation for Soleimani at this point. Can you believe it? What is it?
Yeah.
8 months later?
Well, yeah. I mean,
But
no, go ahead.
yeah, 8 months later, and they're still plotting the retaliation, which we were promised back in which we were promised by both the Iranians and the U.S. in January. So it must be a really big plot. Iran must have something really big up their sleeve if they're gonna be pulling this down. What if they shoot down another drone? I could not imagine.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, Iran firing those missiles on the U.S. base, and the U.S. not retaliating was the retaliation. And I suppose the other retaliation is that Iran is still able to flex its muscle in Syria. For instance, an Iranian drone was caught, basically was bombing Turkish and Turkish-backed forces in Idlib.
Yeah, and on top of that, there
so,
were IRGC forces training Afghan and Kazakh forces in eastern Syria. We'll get into that, but I thought that was a little bit of an interesting development.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that nice Afghan army we poured so much money in is going to fight in Syria now, which is entertaining in a way, watching how these things just all shift. No permanent alliances, no permanent sides. Everyone's out for themselves, which, I mean, that's the way it's always been. But especially in this era, it seems like there's no consistency to it, to the point where in other eras, alliances would shift over a more gradual period of time. But just watching the way things go now, this is the American-led world order. This is the consequence of that. It's interesting to say the least. And
I mean,
it's
basically a war of economics, not really a war of ideas.
Oh yeah, it's and I would say it's at least humorous, above all. Funniest empire, as you put it. I don't know, several months ago. That we probably said it on the show. I don't know whether you said it on air or off air. But point being is, I think that really holds up now. But like I said, this shows, again, at least in my opinion, a movement of solidarity between the enemies of Iran. And substantially, I don't think much will change, because things have been functioning like this for how long. It's something Trump can tout out and say, I'm a great deal maker, I'm a great peacemaker, look at me. You should re-elect me because I can keep the world more safe and stable, making all these deals, making all these old rivals into friends. So, there is that. And if you don't have anything else, I suppose we could move on to Syria.
Yeah.
So, the big news out of Syria is actually new news, but it's also old in terms of when it happened. So, allegedly, Trump wanted to assassinate Assad after the chemical attacks in 2018, but was just supposedly convinced by the sane voice of reason, Mattis, not to. Now, watching these narratives shift back and forth is always very fascinating, because certain times the media, the liberals, they're baying for Assad's blood. He must go. He must be executed. He must be driven out of Syria, etc. His evil regime must fall. Other times, Trump is completely unhinged, insane, as we're seeing right now, for suggesting that we assassinate Assad and not go to war with Syria. Not that I support either of those things. In fact, I'm hardly opposed. I'm very opposed to both of those things. Just to clarify, I don't think any of our regulars need to know. But for any newcomers who weren't around in 2018, 2019, completely non-intervention in Syria. I know I am. I know you are. But
Yeah.
just with that out of the way, and I think it's interesting, and I'm not sure if I believe it. You were saying that it was possibly the other way around, where Mattis
Yeah.
proposed the assassination and Trump was against it, but I think that also makes more
It's a
sense.
possibility.
But go on.
I just say it's a possibility given Trump's relationship with Netanyahu and his family, which like literally does go back decades. I mean, obviously, I can't imagine Netanyahu not wanting Assad assassinated, and it makes sense for me that given Trump's almost inaction in Syria, except for the troops, and some of them were already in Syria before he got elected. It seems to me that it's also just as likely that it was Mattis who wanted Assad assassinated, and it was Trump who said no, and that this story has been basically fabricated. Mattis has to be the fall guy in order to save face with Netanyahu. I think that's just as plausible. I mean, we live in a time where like we're supposed to believe that Trump, went to these military grave sites and called all the men who died there losers.
Yeah, very
And,
important note, because it
boobs.
came from the same source. It comes from this tell-all book of the evils and horrors inside Trump's administration, and I'm here as the hero to expose them all. What's the guy's name? Woodard or something? He's written another book. He wrote Fire and Fury, but keep in mind
Yeah.
that's the source where this comes from right now. So I'm skeptical of it. I could see Trump saying this in a passing manner, not necessarily seriously proposing it, like just saying, well, what if we just assassinate the guy and get it over with? I mean, again, I don't put flippant comments past Trump, but him
Yes,
seriously
that's
suggesting
true.
it, I don't see that.
Yeah, see, that's true too. That it is an angle to overblow some of the statements that Trump makes offhand. Right? The media will treat them as the media treats him like they're in a perma court, right? America is kind of wrapped in a divorce court right now.
Yeah, everything you
And so
can,
anything
everything you say can and will be used against you. Yeah, that right there.
Exactly. So even something that was said just in passing or maybe in jest, that's evidence, right? Because it's a court. That's what we've been watching. They're going to indict Trump, right? The court never stops. So, I don't know how much credit, and I'm not saying this to basically save Trump's ass. The truth is, though, like I've never seen a presidency like this in my life. And I can say that I remember Reagan, I remember Bush, I remember Clinton, I remember Bush Jr., and I remember Obama, and I've never, ever witnessed anything like this. Not even remotely like this.
Oh, he's under constant scrutiny. And again, that's not even as somebody who is like a Trump superfan or anything. My opinion on the guy is honestly, I could not care less about him at this point. He's just, as I said many times throughout the show, just an entertaining figure, just somebody who is there to cause chaos, so I can enjoy him from that angle. But in terms of his re-election prospects, barring a few things, I don't have much investment in Trump, so I tend to agree that my take on it is probably something he said offhand in a national security meeting with Mattis, with the generals, like, just assassinate him and get it over with, I don't care. And they're taking that and really running with it because, again, I don't know why. Their opinion on Syria oscillates depending on what Trump does. when he takes his usual line of being more anti-intervention, wanting to withdraw partially, if not completely, it's we must protect the Kurds, we must fight against the evil tyrant Assad. But if he takes a more hawkish line, like we must punish Assad for his violation of the Geneva Convention, using chemical weapons, blah 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 blah, Trump is a madman who wants to start World War III, and somehow this is actually benefiting Putin, etc., etc., etc.
Right, and you almost get the sense that the way Syria has been managed way back since Obama was in power, that what they were really looking for initially was something similar yet different to what happened in Libya. That is, the people win, right? There has to be a kind of a mythology about it, and it's the American mythology of the people standing up to the tyrant and winning, right? And an assassination by America, in a way, makes it all too obvious, right? And it doesn't, and it looks more like American intervention and less like the people's victory. So I get that sense out of it, and that might be one of the reasons why they didn't want to just assassinate him, because the opportunities to assassinate him probably are not all that few.
Well, what's funny is pretty much if you actually take Trump at his word, taking him completely seriously, what he proposed is pretty much what Obama did in Libya.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, there was no like direct
But
intervention beyond that. It was just we're gonna get Gaddafi killed. Even though I would say there's a bit more tact because they bombed his like escape convoy, and then the his assassins they put in bayonet up a place
yeah,
where the just to put it politely, a place where the sun does not shine. So I'm sure you've all heard the story at this point, but point
yeah.
being is it really was something like that, and you do make the point that it, of course, they had the bill as the People's Revolution, so even him directly taking out Assad would undermine that. But even like if he did a Gaddafi style assassination where he sort of cut off his escape route, not that Assad was escaping Syria at any time, or put him in the position where eventual assassins would find him. But I do think you're onto something. That's probably why the
Yeah, I
suggestion,
mean,
even if completely non-serious, even if made as an offhand statement, was met with such backlash.
right. Like he doesn't understand the subtlety. I mean, not that I think Trump understands subtlety, anyways. But let's not forget that Iraq also initially appeared like a people's revolution, a very poor example, because of course America bombed Iraq for about 10 years before, over 10 years before they invaded it. And then of course they did actually invade it. But ultimately the people who captured Saddam are other Iraqis, and then they bring swift justice. So it creates the hologram of the People's Revolution. It's one of the foundations of America, and so on. And it's also why like America, doesn't always succeed in campaigns against China. Like for instance, let's say Tibet. In a way they dropped Tibet because of course the messaging was that if you have an independent nation, you should really stick up for that, because once your independent nation is gone, no one will weep for you. And the other aspect of that is, this country, China, keeps pushing westward and taking over these indigenous people with their own. Where have I seen this before? Right? So it's not, it's not a very good image, not a great look. As I say, bad optics, right? And that's kind of like what's going on with I guess with the Uyghurs to some extent. Not that it's a parallel with Tibet. I mean, of course, sticking up for them, yes, but again, it like people will talk about how, well, yeah, you pushed all the way to the Pacific and you had to subjugate all these people. So, why are you upset that the Chinese are doing it? So yeah, America has to work within this framework of being the tyrant slayer. But the history and the mythology don't always meet.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what you were saying there. That it, and it goes back to the eternal problem the establishment has with Trump, where fundamentally what he proposes is not that much of a deviation from business as usual, but the way he portrays it, the way he says things, like for example, when he was talking about where we're just gonna take the oil from Syria, or during the campaign, it's like, why don't we just take the oil? Not that I believe these wars for oil. Of course, I know there's a lot more factors in there, a lot more sinister factors in there, but he gives away the game too much. He says too many things that make people question things. Uh, despite, of course, Trump being known as like a liar, he changes his mind however much, he contradicts himself that much. In many ways, he's also much too honest to be an acceptable person to be in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I mean, there's an extraordinary naivete about him, right? He kind of says stuff like that a teenage boy would say. Why don't we just nuke him?
yeah, it's like,
it's not like that, Donald. You can't just nuke people.
yeah, it's what you'd expect from somebody.
I'm exaggerating, but I'm just trying to make a point.
Yeah, well, I mean, he kind of did with North Korea. He said, about the whole red button thing, but he says things that somebody you would expect who has no political experience, somebody who comes from the civilian world stepping into politics immediately would do, because that's exactly what he was. Now, of course, he had all sorts of handlers and advisors, people around him like that, but there's a certain buffoonish, almost endearing quality about Donald Trump that just cannot be erased, even if you have him completely constrained, and we see it to this day.
Yeah.
Now, for other news about Syria, all of a sudden, there is more of a resurgence of fighting in eastern Syria with ISIS cells popping up. Now, who'd have thought? Where did those come from? The usual activity in Idlib, and an alleged assassination attempt on one of the leaders of the Syrian Democratic Forces. So very, very conspicuous things happening in Syria. But again, I think probably I haven't heard any news about the assassinations of Syrian intelligence officers lately. Now, that probably still is happening, just not making the headlines, but I think, again, it is interesting that these pockets of ISIS just pop up. It almost is, as we were discussing off air. See, we say a lot of stuff off air that we have to... It's funny. I mean, off air could be a show of its own at this point, but with that with that out of the way, that... Again, ISIS knows it's not going to be relevant ever again. They know that they're not going to control this territory or take over any country, etc. They do these last-ditch attacks where they pour all their resources into taking out as much as they can. Usually at this point at targets in the Middle East, such as in Iraq, in Syria, and increasingly Libya. So this kind of stuff is really no surprise, and of course, they find themselves in resurgence at the most convenient times for for the United States, for Turkey, for Israel. Very strange how that all works out.
Really weird. Really weird. Who would have thought, right? But yeah, Idlib is far more active in September than it's been in a long time. So within the last 48 hours, Russia went on a bombing campaign in southern Idlib, north of Latakia, and it even bombed just the outskirts of Idlib city itself. That's a new one. This was followed by shelling from the Syrian army on no less than, I think it was 7 or 8 towns at least. So they're putting pressure. There's also Kurdish units that have knocked out let's say it's a Turkish military station. It's on the road. It's when I first read the reports, it sounded impressive. When I saw it, it's not a very big building. However, it was a ballsy move, and I mean that thing was destroyed, and then some time went by, and it was attacked yet again. This is part of the Afrin Liberation Army. It's a Kurdish movement. It's a Kurdish group, and so Turkey's has been dealing with some attacks lately, and they've been pretty good. And we've been seeing this off and on throughout 2020, where they've really begun to assert themselves. One attack that claims some civilians further east and right on the border with Turkey, away from Aleppo, on the other side of Aleppo, is thought to be another ISIS attack, because the Kurds have been generally careful to only attack Turkish military and Turkish insurgents. These are usually jihadists who are supported by Turkey, but they're not regular Turkish infantry. So they've been able to avoid them most of the time. But this attack looks like it was directed directly at civilians, and people are now beginning to consider that this was probably an ISIS attack. So yeah, ISIS, the great spoiler, it's it's all over the place. It's really this chaos agent, and like we've said before, it's there to just prolong the war as much as possible, to keep tipping the balance away on this side, then the other side, so that it perpetuates the war.
That's exactly what they serve this purpose. That purpose they serve at this point. And you do almost see this with some of the Turkish-backed groups in Idlib, which I do also find entertaining. How much infighting they had to become practically the same thing at the. I mean, these were the guys who were killing each other in Aleppo as Syrian forces were breaking down the door. But it's just the way these things they always play out the same. The more, I mean, they try it expecting something new every time, and it always plays out the same. Which, again, this has just been a very amusing news cycle for me lately, because just a bunch of stuff like this keeps on happening, and I suppose that really covers the news we have for Syria, so I suppose we could go on to Libya for a final topic.
Yeah.
So, Libya also, there's been a resurgence of ISIS forces attacking LNA forces. Of course, not GNA forces. As soon as Turkish aid comes in the country, after a month or two, you have these Turkish forces, these Turkish advisors, etc. Egypt has also been very vocal. Egypt foreign minister and Russian foreign minister met in Cairo to jointly call for a ceasefire in Libya. So it looks like the typical approach of applying pressure, fighting back, but also applying the diplomatic pressure and calling for negotiations in Libya. And it's been also a stalemate again. As we discussed over the past few weeks, nobody really wants to fire the first shot. Nobody wants to be responsible for causing a new spark of conflict. Now, for all we know, it could be ISIS this time with the way things have been going. There would be more ridiculous occurrences in 2020. That would be pretty low on the list if that's what really set off the Libyan conflict again, which was just ISIS cell attacks. But we are seeing, again, some things brew under the surface. Of course, more Turkish forces being brought in, some problems with the migrant ships, the European Union, etc. So, just, I would say, business as usual in Libya. I was expecting, if fortunately this didn't happen, a lot more push from the GNA, from the Turkish-backed forces in Libya as we got into the fall. Just that final push of 2020. But it looks like, I don't know, because if Egypt put their foot down because of constraints within the GNA, within their Turkish handlers. I don't know why it didn't happen, but I would probably attribute it more to the Egyptian intervention, or semi-intervention at least, but it looks like things have grinded to a halt, more or less.
You could make the point that the GNA is largely a Turkish-backed project, which is tacitly supported let's say, at a second stage level by the U.S. And that we're seeing Turkey kind of stretched to its limits. America really isn't, I think, to save face, isn't able and isn't willing to help Turkey, in their pursuits in Libya. Not even necessarily openly involving itself in the disputes for gas and oil reserves in the Mediterranean either, right? There's a lot on America's plate right now, and let's not forget the war in Yemen, which Libya is starting to look a lot like, but except the difference being that Yemen has more ISIS, and even though despite more ISIS, the Houthis are able to erode more and more territory and strike deep within Syria. There's been more of that going on lately, and we could see Turkey kind of in a similar situation with Saudi Arabia in 2 or 3 years, where it's in an unwinnable war and it doesn't really know what to do next. Like, Saudi Arabia has to pull out, and it doesn't know how to do that at this point. It has not. It has not succeeded in Yemen, and this is really testament to the power of Shia Muslims and the power of Iran. Um, that's an extraordinary reach for Iran to help out Yemen the way it is, because it has to seriously navigate all these Sunni Muslim countries that most of them ostensibly would be working against it. I don't know what its relationship with Egypt is like at the moment, but it is managing to deliver supplies one way or another, and it is managing to deliver arms one way or another. And so maybe Turkey could find itself overly stretched and not able to resolve these conflicts, neither in Syria, neither in Libya. It isn't able to, to deal the killer blow. And in a way, America might be happy for that, because I don't think they're happy with Erdogan. I think they want somebody compliant. I think they want somebody that, doesn't act like Erdogan, except, put his face against and toward Russia and complies with everything else.
Well, that's
Um,
been Trump's relationship with Erdogan since the beginning, hasn't it? He's always,
yeah.
or I would say Trump's administration, such as Tillerson, Pompeo, etc., they've begrudgingly tolerated him because he is tacitly on their side at the time in Syria and now more so in Libya, but it's something they're willing to put up with some pushback, with some fiery rhetoric, with some moves that do contradict them in order to put that same heat on Russia, put that same heat on Syria, on Iran, and any other various regional rivals the United States may have in the Middle East. But it could be that you have this joint declaration from Russia and Egypt because they feel that Turkey might be, uh, again, at a standstill where they could actually be brought to the negotiating table. So maybe we may see a at least temporary peace deal in Libya over the next few weeks.
It's certainly possible. Yeah, at least we've got a truce. I think it might take more than a month, but it's possible.
Yeah, it is, and I would say it looks more on the horizon than it has at any point since the initial Turkish intervention. I would say about 2.5, 3 months ago. It's been about that long at this point during the summer. So we may see something come out of Libya after all. And just one last piece of news I saw right now from a few hours ago I want to bring up is the Justice Department has opened up a criminal investigation against John Bolton for his most recent book against on his writings against the Trump administration. Now,
Oh
of
wow.
course, the claims are always, oh, it's classified information, he's disclosing this without permission, etc. How much of it is politicized, how much of it he's actually divulging, will be interesting to see, but I think there would be no more fitting end to John Bolton's career than to be taken down by the Trump Justice Department. So, despite how trumped up these charges are, I hope something does come of them. If he's not charged, imprisoned, or whatever, I hope this drives him into complete irrelevance, at least.
It would be great to see.
Because
I have
it's a lose lose either way. Because now I'm sure he has great lawyers that can get him off, but if he actually did disclose information, he is breaking these laws that he has been a great advocate for, that he is like championed and talked about national security. National security hawk breaking these laws is pretty rich. But if he gets off, there is always the question: is everything he just said just a bald faced lie? Can we really trust what's in here? So
mhm.
there's really no winning scenario for John Bolton in this. So I'm not saying they're all career enders, but a couple of them are, and we can only be so lucky.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also for people with Trump derangement syndrome. Ultimately, right? Like the Pentagon just released a report after an apparently exhaustive um, research to see if the claims that Russia was putting bounties on American soldiers in Afghanistan. Uh, so they've formally come out that it's false. The truth is as I said earlier in the show, America is extremely divided. It's in this prolonged divorce that doesn't look like anything amicable is going to be is going to happen, and you've got sides that are just going to believe whatever rhetoric supports their argument, whatever supports their narrative. And Bolton is one of these guys who's going to write the books, and he's valuable to liberals because the liberals will say, I don't even like this guy, and look what he said, and he's a Republican. That's to add a certain amount of authenticity and I suppose authority to their argument, right? And he knows he can make money on that. He's a grifter himself.
Yeah, I would say that pretty much sums up John Bolton almost as good as Tucker Carlson's description of being a bureaucratic tapeworm. But I think I think that's everything.
Yeah, I don't have let's see, we covered Yemen, Libya, Syria, Kosovo, Belarus, even a little bit of Navalny. That's all I've got.
Yeah, it's all the news I had for this week, and I once again apologize for being a little stuffed up. I hope that doesn't impede the quality of the show too much. I know I've been suppressing a lot of sneezes. Always have my finger on that mute button. But I hope it's enjoyable either way. I hope it's entertaining, and I hope we all come away having learned something, or at least I would like to think I'm doing that valuable of a service. But who knows? That's for you guys to be the judge. So we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
And take care.